Olá, ouvintes e espectadores do canal Cláudio Dantas, do portal Cláudio Dantas. Eu sou Eli Vieira, eu sou colunista do portal, e no nosso interesse de trazer formação e mobilização, estou aqui trazendo para vocês uma entrevista exclusiva com um dos maiores especialistas em liberdade de expressão do mundo, é o Jacob Mchangama. Jacob, ele é um advogado dinamarquês, e ele escreveu essa história global da liberdade de expressão, e está chegando em português aqui no Brasil pelo Instituto Civis, e o Instituto Civis está dando 500 cópias gratuitas, vou ganhar a minha também, e está aqui o título em português para vocês. Então, o Jacob, assim, ele está em todas quando se trata de liberdade de expressão. Se você sabe, por exemplo, da FIRE, que é a maior organização atualmente pela liberdade de expressão dos Estados Unidos, lá está o Jacob como um dos senior fellows, como um dos membros lá da diretoria deles. Eu comprei um livro recentemente do presidente da FIRE, Greg Lukianoff, lá está o Jacob de novo escrevendo o prefácio. Então, assim, é um dos maiores do mundo, eu não estou exagerando, especialista em liberdade de expressão. So, let's have the man of the hour here with me. Hey, Jacob, thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Of course, my pleasure. It's great to be in Brazil.
I hope so. How's Brazil treating you? So it's been a week now, right?
Yeah, really well. 4 nights or so. I really enjoy it. Been doing lots of talks, meeting with interesting people, journalists, civil society organizations, students, experts, and at the same time been enjoying São Paulo, and yeah, it's been great.
Good to know. It's good to know you haven't been reading the news in my country, because things get worse and worse by the day.
Yeah. Well, I think you need to have be able to have some cognitive dissonance and be able to enjoy the beautiful things in life, even while the bad news keep coming at you.
Yeah, that's a good perspective to have. And speaking of perspective, so I have now your book. I had the ebook before, so I've read about a third of it. And I want to thank you because I'm getting to meet some heroes of free speech. For example, I never heard of Dirk Cohnert from the Netherlands
Yeah.
before I pick up your book. Even some unexpected things like Muslim heroes of free speech, some Christian heroes of free speech that are affiliated with denominations that would be held as even radical and extreme. And you offer some. Let's start from the very broad to get to specifics, and then to Brazil.
Yeah.
So one of the things, and you mentioned in your talk that I saw a year ago in London, about, let's start with that two-part perspective, or two great approaches in history to free speech, the Roman one and the Greek one. Do you think that applies broadly in history, still applies today? Tell us what it is, please.
Yeah. So my book, I have I set out two competing approaches to free speech. One is the Athenian model, which is an egalitarian conception of free speech, a bottom-up approach to free speech. The other one is a Roman approach to free speech, which is more top-down and elitist. And so the Athenian egalitarian free speech model is based on Athens' direct democracy, where you had two concepts of free speech. One was called isogoria, meaning equality of speech, especially political speech. Every freeborn male citizen had a right to participate in the ecclesia, the assembly, where they would debate and vote on matters of public affairs. So that was very, very different to many other Greek city-states that were more oligarchic in nature, or even had kings. It was a stark contrast to Sparta, the traditional rivals of Athens. But they also had another concept called parousia, meaning uninhibited or fearless speech. So this was, you might call it, a civic commitment to tolerance of debate and even controversial ideas. It was a culture of free speech that permeated Athenian democracy. So while equality of political speech was limited to citizens, parousia was extended broadly to people who even non-citizens. So take a good example. Aristotle was not an Athenian citizen, but he was he wrote in Athens. He set up a lyceum in Athens, and of course even enemies or people who are very critical of democracy could philosophize in Athens. Plato was very
Yeah.
critical of democracy, but he was a very prominent philosopher there. And the openness to different ideas, you see that articulated in Pericles' famous funeral oration, where he extols the virtues of the Athenian democracy. He says, power here is not with the few, but with the many, and everyone can say whatever they want. He also sort of contrasts this with Sparta. He says, here we're not afraid to throw our city gates open even to our enemies. They can come and inspect the city. We're not afraid of that. That was very different to Sparta, and so the consequences of that you can really see by contrasting Athens with Sparta. You can see, how many famous philosophers from Sparta do you know?
Yeah.
Probably not one. Whereas Athens really became the cradle of Western civilization, with many famous philosophers, including the two rock stars of Western philosophy, Plato and Aristotle, and of course also the home of Socrates. Now, a lot of people, of course, will say, well, the Greeks executed Socrates, so how could they be in favor of free speech? But I think this is something that is relevant to today as well. It's that the Athenians, with time, became um, afraid that the democracy would be undermined by speech. This is maybe something that you will sound familiar to Brazilian
It
ears,
does.
right? That
Definitely does.
you censor free speech, you punish people um, uh, for their speech in the name of defending democracy. And that's ultimately, I think, what happened with Socrates. He was someone who had very close relationships with oligarchs who had overthrown the Athenian democracy on a couple of occasions. And so, and he was also critical of the Athenian democracy, because a lot of people, and this is something that we can get back to when it comes to the Romans, a lot of people were critical of the idea that the uneducated masses should have a right to participate in democracy, that they should have power, that their voices, their votes should count equally as much as the well-educated um, elites. And this was a perspective that Socrates also shared to a certain extent. And so this may be one of the reasons why he was ultimately executed. But if we contrast Athens with Rome, the Roman Republic, you see an even more sharp contrast. So the Romans also believed in free speech. It was part of libertas, the larger, wider Roman freedom. But they didn't have a specific concept for free speech in the Roman Republic. And they also saw it as much more elitist. So it was a top, it was to be exercised by wealthy, well-educated elites, people like Cicero, people like Cato, but not the ordinary Roman citizens. So in a political assembly in Rome, ordinary people did not have a right to speak. They were addressed by magistrates, unlike in Athens. And if you ask someone like Cicero, he would say that Athens had a great culture, philosophy, but the reason why the Athenian democracy was collapsed was because they allowed the uneducated, unwashed mob into the assemblies to make decisions that they were not fit to make, going on silly military adventures, prosecuting their best citizens or sending them into exile, and so on. And so Cicero was definitely not in favor of Athenian free speech. To the Romans, the Athenians allowed licentiousness of speech, like speech that was harmful to society. And I think when you look at the world today, and really throughout history of free speech, these two competing models are constantly in tension. Uh, the egalitarian Athenian model, bottom up, everyone should have a voice in public affairs. It's crucial that even the lowest have a voice, and that you don't allow an elite to monopolize power, monopolize public discourse. And then a Roman one where you say free speech needs to be filtered by um, institutional elites, gatekeepers, and so you see that with the printing press, you
Yes.
see it with social media, and you see it in Brazil with the Supreme Court.
And these perspectives, when people rediscovered free speech, often because they were being censored by the government or some powerful organization like a church, did they rediscover? Did they start from scratch, or were the words from the Athenian democracy reverberating through time and finding new voices to re-express what was? So my question is essentially that: was the idea rediscovered often, or was it very contingent upon that culture from ancient Athens?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, obviously, Greek philosophy was a game changer in when rediscovered. When transmitted, for instance, into the Abbasid caliphates, and the Abbasid caliphate then translated almost all secular Greek philosophy. Interestingly enough, they did not translate Aristotle's Politics, and you can see why, because it discusses various forms of ways to govern a city-state, from democracy to despotism, and that was not something that the caliphs probably were interested in. So, but the concept of Athenian free speech really doesn't make, I think, a doesn't become the inspirational model until the 18th century. It's the Roman model has more influence, I would say, among early Enlightenment thinkers. So you don't have this, with some exceptions, you don't really have a commitment to full egalitarian free speech. And those that did, if in the 17th century, um, were not directly referencing Athens, but they certainly had some of the same ideas, but they didn't reference Athens. And I think for a very long time, the Athenian democracy was seen with skepticism, even by the founding fathers of America. Were very skeptical of this direct democracy because it didn't have checks and balances the way that the American Constitution has, for instance. This was one of the reasons why Socrates could be prosecuted and convicted by a jury of several hundreds of Athenians without, he didn't have a First Amendment protecting his free speech.
And another pattern you notice throughout history is what you call Milton's curse, right?
Yes.
I'm tempted, pun intended, to say Milton's temptation, because even as someone who deals with this topic daily, sometimes I'm tempted to say, okay, so this looks like, to give you a concrete example. Recently, this man in Brazilian social media on X, he said that he was reacting to a photo of a very rich, wealthy Brazilian man and his daughter. And his daughter has had this purse that costs about $5,000 or so. So he is a Marxist. To him, that's offensive for someone to have so much money. And he said only the guillotine could be a solution to this. So many people saw that as incitement to violence.
Yeah.
And I think most people, even people who say they are pro free speech, see that case as going too far, and that it's fair for him to be prosecuted and pay dearly for what he has said. So, have you been tempted by Milton's curse, or and tell me what you think about this case I mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, I think all human beings are tempted by Milton's curse. I think free speech is a very difficult and very often counterintuitive example or principle for human beings. I think we probably did not evolve. I don't think, maybe free speech was not I mean, communication was obviously hugely important for human evolution, language, and so on, but free speech was not necessarily what made us survive and transcend from hunter-gatherers to complex civilization that we live in today. You can imagine that, if you needed to make decisions for the survival of a group, you needed to have a strong leader, and you needed to have some taboos and ideas that kept the group together, and that there would be very grave consequences for someone who transgressed those taboos, and you couldn't just sit around and have democratic decision making all the time. And so, given our tribal nature, given our also our the fact that we are very often guided by our emotions rather than reasons as human beings, it's very tempted to sort of say, well, free speech is important, but not for this type of speech. I mean, I don't know the full context of the example you said. To me, that would not be speech that should be punished. It's something that should probably be morally condemned, depending on how serious it was. But I would not construe it as a direct incitement to violence. I think you should have to set the bar quite high for when you would say this is a direct incitement to violence, rather than sort of a distasteful comment on social media, right? So from just how you described to me, I would say that we should hold our noses and tolerate it.
Yeah. So many scholars in Brazil, even in law scholars, they see it, I'd say they see the free speech as a matter of maybe relativistic a bit. They think, okay, so instead of talking about paresia, and there's a long history that the American model is actually not only American, it has a history behind it, as you show on your book. So they see that, okay, that's one model. And the other model, which they favor, is the European one. So as an European man, as a Danish man,
Yeah.
what do you say to that? Is that it's just a matter of choosing a model?
Yeah, I mean, so you can look at European democracy, and one perspective, like if let me steelman the European model, which, I mean, it's not a monolith model. There are big differences between Denmark and Germany, for instance, in how we protect free speech. But it's true that Europe as a whole does not protect political speech to the same degree as the First Amendment, United States. And if you want to steelman the argument, it's say, since World War II, Europe has created a very successful democracies. There's a peaceful transfer of power at elections. You have pluralistic media. There are no political prisoners, and this is something quite rare in human history. And okay, so it's an okay price to pay to have laws against hate speech that sometimes are being used to punish people who say ugly things on social media. Given what went before, this is a tolerable state of affairs. And some might even say, well, this is necessary to preserve the delicate social peace on a continent that has seen so much bloodshed. My take, so I, you can understand why people around the world will say, well, yes, let's go for the European model. These are successful democracies, wealthy democracies, and so what's the danger? I would say that I'm skeptical of this take. It's certainly true that the established traditional European democracies are not authoritarian states. But if you look over the past 10 years, it's also true that free speech is coming under increasing pressure, that European elites, governments, institutions have shifted their perspective on free speech and view it increasingly as much as a threat to democracy, as a safeguard for democracy. So they no longer, and they don't view it the way that Americans view it, as the most important right in a democracy, really as a meta right, as a safeguard for all other rights, as a safeguard for any meaningful democracy. That I don't think is the European model. It's an important right, but one that has to be balanced against other considerations, and one, if used or abused in ways that threaten democracy and democratic values, including tolerance and equality, can and must be restricted. I'm not convinced by this argument. In my book, I talk about what I call the Weimar fallacy, this idea that the lessons of the rise of totalitarianism, fascism, and Nazism in Europe is a call for a militant democracy, a democracy which is not afraid to be intolerant towards the intolerant, in order to, to paraphrase Karl Popper, in order to safeguard tolerance. But I try to show in my book that this is not an accurate depiction of what actually happened in Germany in the short-lived Weimar Republic from 1918 to 1933. That in fact there were limits on free speech in the Weimar Republic, and as the Weimar Republic hurled towards its ultimate destruction, there more and more emergency laws restricting free speech were adopted to try and protect democracy, both against communists but also against fascists, and that these laws very often played into the hands of Nazis, for instance, who could portray themselves as martyrs that would create extra attention for them, but that more tragically actually also provided them with a facade of legality for the suppression that they use. So you could argue that the speech restrictions of the Weimar Constitution and Weimar laws that were supposed to protect democracy were used by the Nazis to abolish democracy once they were in power. Now, obviously, you can't explain the rise of Nazism through the narrow prism of free speech and censorship. There were many more important factors in place. But if your argument today in the 21st century is to say that we need speech restrictions in democracies in order to prevent a repeat of history, a repeat of Nazism, something that we all agree, I hope, is a paramount objective, then I don't think the history of the Weimar Republic supports that narrative.
And I see this point being made by activist types. You are that, but also a scholar. But I see Nadine Strossen making that point about the Weimar fallacy. Also, Fleming Rose, the editor for Gillen's Post. And so that's where I found this argument. Actually, I found it first in Fleming Rose. And is academia not doing their job? Because as a scholar, am I just not aware of a scholarship that makes this point, or is the biases we know about academia, are they interfering and not letting the message through?
I mean, there are scholars who write critically about this. Eric Heinz is a scholar from the University of Queen Mary in London. He's very critical of hate speech laws. I think he writes quite with a lot of insight about this. I think generally speaking, people have not really looked into the history of the Weimar Republic. I think it's just taken for granted in European history that our institutions in Europe, our values are essentially built as the antithesis to the horrors of Nazism. I mean, it's certainly true that Nazism used propaganda, right? They use speech to mobilize masses. You can't argue against that. And so it's just taken for granted that that this is necessary. So if you look at the European Court of Human Rights, which is the top, it's the parallel to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights here in Latin America, which decides the limits of free speech in the 47 member states of the Council of Europe. It takes it as dogma that it is necessary to prohibit hate speech, even without really defining it. and it does so with a reference to history. So it's sort of baked in as dogma, as constitutional of a European democratic model, that you have to restrict free speech. Interestingly enough, though, especially in Western Europe, the same logic does not apply to communism, even though communism was in place for much longer than Nazism, even though the victims of communism outnumber the number of victims of Nazism, of course, because communism was in place for a longer time. And you've actually seen some conflict between Western European states and Central and Eastern European states who only recently came out from under communism. Some of these, because the European Union adopted this law, which said, well, member states should criminalize Holocaust denial. And then the former communist states, many of them actually criminalized the denial of the crimes of communism. And they said, well, we also want the European Union to criminalize the denial of the crimes of communism. And here, the European Union said no, and the European Court of Human Rights has also said, well, no, you can't, in Hungary or in a number of other states, you can't just criminalize symbols of communism, even though you can, even though Germany can criminalize Nazi symbols. And to me, that's just a deeply inconsistent approach, right? If you, it's not clear to me that Europe would be in a better place if Stalinism was revived and became the governing model of Europe than if Nazism was revived. The consequences would be would be catastrophic for democracy in both cases. And I think that goes to the heart of this matter, that it ultimately is to a very wide extent subjective of what you determine as hate speech or extreme
Yeah.
speech that lies without outside the limits.
Okay, so before we get to Brazil, so we spoke about the broad patterns you observed in history in studying the global history of free speech. So is there any other you could mention besides Milton's curse and the clash between ancient Athens and Rome and their influence after that? So is there more examples you could give us of repeating patterns?
Yeah, I think one thing that is really important to think about is how a decentralized ecosystem of information and ideas is conducive to free speech. It allows it to flourish. So, for instance, in ancient Athens, there was no Inquisition, right? There was no, I mean, obviously they didn't have a printing press, but they didn't have like an office of censor that could prohibit free speech. You could be taken to court, but that allowed free speech to flourish much more. The printing press decentralized free speech, it decentralized authority, right? Before, it was much easier for the Catholic Church to suppress heretical ideas. Martin Luther was not the first person to challenge the authority of the Catholic Church with different ideas, but he was the first person to be able to use the printing press to very effective in a very effective ways, because he was brilliant at writing short, punchy, polemical treatises. You could compare it with the way that people use social media today, right? When if you're effective in social media, you don't write long, boring treatises in Latin. You write something that is immediately accessible, that appeals to emotions of people. You use memes, the way that Martin Luther would use cartoons that would sort of demonize the Catholic Church and the Pope and cardinals. And so that decentralizes free speech. And you see, as the printing press spreads around Europe, you suddenly see an explosion of new ideas. It becomes much more easy to disseminate science, new ideas. It becomes much more difficult for centralized authority to keep ideas in check. Of course, every time you decentralize free speech, there's an immediate counter reaction to try and impose top-down control. So you have the index of censorship of the Catholic Church. You have states, both Catholic and Protestant, that will impose free publication censorship, licensing to try and control printing presses. But again, like the internet decentralizes, obviously, in very important ways. Suddenly, people around the world can access and share information across borders without any censorship. But again, then you have a counter reaction to that, as you see in Brazil. Now we have generative AI. Generative AI is hugely decentralizing unless you have like a central authority that tries to control the content of AI. So to me, the decentralization of the ecosystem of information and ideas is essential to the flourishing of freedom of expression. So that I think is really important. Another lesson I think is that, and this is something that might also be quite relevant in a country where a stand-up comedian can be sent to prison for 8 years for hate speech, is that free speech may really be the most powerful engine of human equality that our species has ever come across. Unlike much of the rhetoric that we see today, where free speech is seen as a weapon against minorities on the part of the powerful, free speech has been absolutely essential for persecuted groups, minorities, whether it's abolition of slavery in the US, civil rights movement in the US, the fight against racial segregation, the right for the fight for LGBT rights. Speech was absolutely essential to that. The right of women, women did not have political power. They didn't have guns. How do they achieve equality? Well, through campaigning, by shining a light on the injustice of misogynist attitudes, of the inherent injustice of saying, we have universal human rights, but half of the population of the world don't, in a country, don't have the right to vote, don't have the right to speak up. So speech is a great equalizer of power. It's absolutely essential. So Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, said that the right of speech is a very precious one, especially to the oppressed. And you see some of the same rhetoric coming from Nelson Mandela. He showed how free speech was absolutely essential to the defeat of apartheid. Gandhi's fight against British colonialism also relied on speech, and he was punished for it. And he gave this great speech saying that you should be free to criticize any person or system up until the point where you advocate for violence. So I think that's a really important lesson today when that logic has been flipped on its head.
So, in other words, another pattern in history you see is technology comes up that decentralizes production of speech, of expression, and then there are elite panics. Are these panics mostly from the elites, or would the masses sometimes also show panics and that are behind new waves of censorship?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to new technology, I think it's typically the elites who and you see this, for instance, in today's digital age. So there was a time when newspapers were seen as a revolutionary activity, and something that was frowned upon. Then newspapers became the prime, and traditional media became the prime outlet for the exercise of free speech, and that meant that editors, journalists, reporters were de facto gatekeepers of the public sphere, right? It gave them, even though in principle, every Brazilian under the constitution enjoyed freedom of expression, in practice, it would be the editors of Globo, Folha, and so on that decided who got to speak, that decided the perspective, that framed the discussion for 200 million people in in Brazil. With the advent of social media and the internet, that completely changes. Suddenly, you have this rascal Eli Vieira having his YouTube channel and saying things that goes against elite perspectives, right? That's dangerous.
Yeah.
You should write a letter to the editor, and he can decide whether your perspective has enough value to contribute to the public debate. Uh,
Definitely, yeah. So I was advised today by my mother, of all people, to be more careful about what I write, because yesterday I wrote something against Moraes' book, which is basically his defense of his perspective, I'd say his censorship, applied to social media. He calls them the dangerous populists anyway, and my mom thinks I went too far in criticizing, I should be more careful. Anyway, so since we've already introduced Brazil, I want to show the audience something you wrote with your partner, Jeff Kosef, right? From
yes.
Vanderbilt University. You worked together there. So this is from March. And I wrote something, I think I wrote before you, something very similar. So I took, so for the audience to be up to date with this, so this is essentially your reaction to Moraes censoring, banning Rumble from Brazil
Yeah.
after he had months before banned X, Twitter, for 40 days. So I did something similar that you did here. Of course, not as you are a law scholar after all, so you did it with more technicality. But I took uh, the quotes he uses from Mill's On Liberty essay, and I sent them via email to the John Stuart Mill Institute in Britain. And they
Yeah.
replied they were very surprised that Mill should be used for censorship to ban whole social media platforms. And I believe, Jacob, that Moraes replied either to me or to you and Jeff last month. So not only him, but the other Supreme Court judges, they struck down the Article 19 from our main internet law, Marco Civil da Internet, which was the free speech clause of the whole law. And,
Yeah.
and, and he had been violating that same article when he was banning whole profiles, because the article predicts only the content itself, the post itself, should be removed if it violates some law. So he was already doing something. They call this protagonism. Some people more critical of these actions by the Supreme Court call it judicial activism. Anyway, so you're the guest here. So let's see. First, summarize to us what your title is. Mill rolls in his grave. So, how did you
Yeah.
feel when you came across Moraes's use of Mill?
Yeah, I mean, and it was not, when I read that decision, one thing was that he was essentially, I should be careful with my words, but it was like, I felt like it was an act of necrophilia against Judge Stuart Mill, because he was essentially vandalizing the main point in Judge Stuart Mill's On Liberty, right? Mill provides quote after quote about why it's like even false information and wrong ideas should not be prohibited. They actually have value because when they clash with other opinions, you get a clearer perspective. And of course, Moraes is right in saying that Mill mentions harm, but the examples that Mill gives of harm is like a very specific harm. It's not wrong ideas. It's not disinformation. And then he also invokes a decision from the US Supreme Court from 1919 to justify this decision to ban Rumble. But that decision was one that allowed the US government to punish peaceful protests against American involvement in World War One and send people to prison for 10 years. And that decision has been overturned for a very, very long time. And the American Supreme Court has clearly said that free speech also protects false information, except in very, very narrow circumstances. So, in that sense, I think it's very, very surprising to have a Supreme Court judge misinterpreting John Stuart Mill and referencing a decision from the US Supreme Court, which has been overturned and which everyone in America agrees was a shameful episode in American history. It's actually one of the reasons, those decisions was one of the reasons why Supreme Court judges try to have interpreted the First Amendment in a more speech protective manner, because there was a realization that the government went way too far in cracking down on controversial speech.
So yeah, precedent essentially established, right? The how the First Amendment is still interpreted to this day, and you're referring, of course, to the 1969 decision Brandenburg, right? And he ignores essentially, besides misusing Mill, he ignores that Oliver Wendell Holmes changed his mind essentially, right?
Yes,
After reading
yes,
Mill, probably, right?
yes. Mill was
Uh,
very, he the interesting, Oliver Wendell Holmes changed his mind. He read Mill. He engaged with a number of sort of more liberal, left-leaning young academics who showed him the dangers, and he also engaged with people who were subjected to cancel culture for their views, for their leftist views, by more conservative viewpoints. And so, yes, he changed his mind, and that helped transform the interpretation of the First Amendment in a much more speech protective, manner. This is completely ignored by Moraes in his decision, and I think it's quite worrying that a Supreme Court justice either manipulates or is unaware of this. I hope it's ignorance, because then that can be ameliorated. I hope it's not sort of a manipulation where you just consciously presents. I mean, you might, if you used his own standards, you might call his decision an exercise in fake news.
yeah. So yeah, so precedent is a problem in Brazil, but a blessing in America in that sense. So aren't you worried that so much depends on precedent? Well, what if the six, conservative judges you have now at the Supreme Court just decide to go against the 1969 decision? Could that happen? Maybe it's very unlikely, but
Mm.
do you see that as a bane or a boon, that it so much depends on precedent?
Yeah, no, it's for instance, some of the conservative judges have been very critical of New York Times versus Sullivan. So New York Times versus Sullivan is this case. It's a civil rights case, essentially from 1964, where civil rights activists working on behalf of Martin Luther King took out an ad in New York Times criticizing, I think, a police official in Alabama, and there were some factual errors in the ad, and so it was a very common tactic for southern states, white supremacist states that had racial segregation, to sue people who wrote critically about racial segregation, and then an all-white jury would award damages. In this case, $500,000, which was a lot of money even in 1964, right? Even more than today. And then the Supreme Court said, no, you cannot. If you criticize a public official, you can't. You're free to do so unless there's actual malice. So that sets a very high standard for when a public official, for instance, can successfully sue for libel when, for instance, criticized in the media. There are some conservative judges who are critical, who thinks this goes too far. I think that we've seen, this is another example of Milton's curse, of course, is that the Trump administration, even though it said it came into power, it said we're going to restore free speech, it has done the opposite. It has gone after the media. It has gone after migrants who have opinions they don't like. It has gone after universities, demanding that they change curriculums and so on. It has gone after law firms who have represented people critical of Donald Trump. And we have a lot of cases, not yet from the Supreme Court, but from lower courts that use strong free speech precedents in saying, no, you cannot punish, the government cannot punish people or institutions based on viewpoints. In other words, just because the government doesn't like what you said or the positions that you present, you cannot punish them. So that's my hope, that this precedent will stay strong. But one of the things that I also discuss in the book is that ultimately free speech depends on a culture of free speech, right? It depends on public support for free speech. So
Yeah.
if most Americans are fine with less speech protections, then the new generations of judges and politicians and civil society leaders will ultimately change the current precedents. So there's no guarantee that the current president will be as strong and speech protective as it is now, but it's definitely been the case that it is if it was interpreted in the same way as Brazil in the United States, um, there would a lot of institutions and media outlets and others would be in a lot of trouble because they wouldn't have that strong constitutional guarantee.
I've been following you for a long time, so I know you are a consistent man. You have criticized the woke or identitarian left in the past, in the recent past. So to some people, one thing that happened in the Free Speech Forum this year, you couldn't be there this year. Jeff was there. That someone said, Chatham House rules. I cannot say who, but someone said that the Trump administration is now currently a greater threat to free speech than wokeness ever was. Of course, it's not a competition, but what's your assessment? Because for me, I wrote a book on wokeness as well, so it was something that was cooked and applied for over a decade. Trump, not sure about but now of course Trump has the power. He has
Yeah.
the state behind him. So what's your assessment?
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I mean, we're only 6 months into the Trump presidency, but already, I mean, he has done a lot more to restrict and punish speech than the Biden administration did. I mean, conservatives were rightly outraged when the Biden administration leaned on social media platforms to remove content, even though they didn't. Um, um, Even though they didn't necessarily violate the First Amendment, they tried to use their powers in a more subtle way. But the Trump administration is not shy about directly flexing its power to go after ideas. And what I think is depressing is that a lot of people on the right who are screaming about wokeness have very little to say about this, or they sort of get into this um, mindset of, well, the danger of wokeness was so great that this is justified, right? Which I think is an extremely unhelpful way of thinking about it, because then you could say, well, identitarian wokeness and its intolerance was then justified because there was a recent history of oppression of minorities. So, so it comes back to like what was the original sin of censorship, right? um, was it justified for um, for the Christians to persecute the pagans because Christians were persecuted by Nero in
Yeah.
in Rome, right? I mean, that's a completely unhelpful way of thinking about free speech, and it's tempting because it absolves you of of looking at yourself in the mirror, and it gives you a sense of moral righteousness. The other side is the one that's dangerous, and therefore my actions, my intolerance is justified. But
Yeah.
if that's your MO, then there's no free speech, because human beings can always convince themselves that their specific perspective is the righteous one.
Yeah, as you said, it's a matter of, maybe free speech is unintuitive because of our tribal loyalties and instincts. And when you start with this thing of who started it, right? As children, we all
Yeah.
did that. So,
Yeah, it's like a playground mentality, right?
exactly, yeah. So
Yeah.
speaking
But
speaking of,
yeah, but I don't I also think, there's this what also frustrates me a little bit is that there's a lack of accountability on the left. So a lot of people on the left were talking about how they were first of all dismissing wokeness and cancel culture, saying this is just like a right wing, canar. And there was also this tendency in the United States for people on the left to sort of say, well, the First Amendment and free speech has been weaponized by the right. I think you see the same thing in Brazil, that free speech is now being portrayed as a right wing talking point, which makes people on the left who were traditionally, yeah, who were the victims under the military dictatorship, I guess, more
yeah,
uncomfortable in defending free speech. But now, when people on the left are under attack by the Trump administration, they rally around free speech without acknowledging that the people who were staying true to principles have been proven correct, right?
yeah.
That all the people who warned them, if you abandon free speech, one day someone will be in power who will then go after you, and you will have no defenses left. So I think there's a failure to acknowledge that on the part of the left, unfortunately.
Definitely, and as I told you, they are about to give Moraes a prize, a prestigious literature prize in Brazil. They've created last year an academic version of that. So he's a finalist already for this year, and I see that as an example of left-wing bias on the prize, and it's shown this bias before. So yeah, so I agree with you that the Trump administration is going too far. At first I saw that case of Mahmoud Khalil, and okay, so he might have actually done stuff, incited something, he stopped students from walking around on campus in Colombia. And then so at first I was sympathetic, but then, well, as information came, so it was more about what he said than what he did. So then,
Yeah,
then I guess I jumped off the bandwagon. So that was
yeah,
the case I was thinking
yeah,
about when I told you that
yeah.
it's hard
And there,
sometimes to
yeah.
resist.
And there are even more egregious example, like the student from Tufts University, a Turkish citizen, where it seems that her what she did, she wrote a piece in a student newspaper, critical of Israel, right? So there was no suggestion there that she was involved in any kind of harassment or violent activities. It was just the exercise of her speech. And I mean, this is also frustrating. Like, I don't know if you saw the interview between Mike Pence and Marco Rubio, Mark, so which demonstrated to me like Milton's curse in action. So on the one hand, you have Marco Rubio saying yes, he was very concerned about how American citizens might be face consequences for their social media posts in other countries, like if they were to travel to London and be arrested or denied access. But Marco Rubio has signed orders, or that where he's very clear that if you have opinions that the Trump administration doesn't like, he's going to revoke your visa, your green card, and throw you out of the country. He's using AI to scan the social media profile of immigrants. So how can you hold those two positions at the same time? And I think that's sort of the weaponization. That's the real weaponization of free speech, right? When you use it for transparently um, tribal motives, and completely undermine free speech.
Yeah. So you are the CEO, executive director for the Future of Free Speech Foundation, right? So the
Yes.
name says a lot because what's coming next is something of concern to me as it is to you. So I'll show the audience this report produced by your organization, and it does you did research Brazil, right? And you
Yes.
showed okay, so Brazil here it is. It's a middling, no, at least a little worse than middling results. So explain to me what is being shown here.
Yeah, so it's the second survey we've done of more than 30 countries around the world. So we asked people in around the world, a number of questions related to their support for free speech. Both sort of like, should people have the right to say what they want without government censorship? Should they be allowed to criticize the government, access the internet, and so on? And most people, including in Brazil, say yes, more than 90%. But then we also asked them, should you have the right to offend minorities, offend your religion, insult the national flag, express support for homosexual relationships? And there you see huge differences between countries, and also within countries. So in Brazil, there's very low support. I think maybe 40% or so for offending minorities. There's also a minority who supports the right to offend religion. And I think maybe 36% of the Brazilian population, only 36% support the right to insult the national flag. Now, admittedly, the Brazilian flag is very beautiful, and someone who's, who has followed Brazilian football and cheered for the Brazilian national team at many World Cups, I understand why it will hurt to see the Brazilian national flag insulted, but that's part of free speech, right? To even insult national symbols. But that shows sort of Milton's curse is well and alive in most countries. And what we've also seen in this year's edition, the last edition was in 2021, is that there's m- m- a higher degree of countries where there's a lower support for free speech in 2021 than an increase in support. And I think Brazil is also one of the countries where we see a decrease in support.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, the United States was the country with the third largest drop in support for free speech, and the US dropped from third to ninth. So that's maybe concerning when it comes to the culture of free speech in the United States.
Yeah, I'm showing this now. So Brazil is there. Yeah. So a drop. So that's a very interesting way to see this. Maybe powerful forces that are currently suffering from Milton's curse, then they stop supporting free speech, and then they support more restrictions. And very interestingly, the country Pakistan leads on the change. I'm sure it doesn't lead on the policies
Yeah,
or
no,
free speech culture, but more people are supporting it since 2021. Right?
yeah. And some of the really interesting things, which maybe be especially interesting to Brazil because it relates to Latin America, is that consistently through our surveys, Venezuelans have shown very high support for free speech. So maybe that is shows that people who live under increasing authoritarian measures value free speech, at least if they've lived in countries that used to have some tradition of independent pluralistic media, which certainly is not the case now. So maybe Brazil just needs to have Venezuelan conditions for a number of years, and you will all come to treasure free speech more.
I hope education could do it. I hope we don't go that way. But
Me
yeah,
too.
so speaking of, so yeah, you can see we have hard work ahead of us on the culture of free speech in Brazil. So there's a lot
Yeah.
to
And I
talk
think,
about.
and it does help, obviously, when you have deep polarization. That is a challenge to a culture of free speech because you lack that critical mass of people who, despite disagreeing on first principles still value free speech as essential to social peace, who recognize that free speech is the only way that we can have a peaceful society where we can live with friends, neighbors, colleagues, spouses who view the world very different from us, but we can still discuss these things peacefully. We can come to pragmatic solutions through democratic means while debating things, and we don't have to resort to violence or oppression.
Yeah, if it were just a matter of changing the law, I've organized this bill that would strike down all of the legal, prescriptions of censorship in Brazil. But it's very hard. Even it was with a member of a deputado, a member of Congress, but then he gave up when they came across this one thing. So a challenge for you, since I'm speaking with the one of the world's foremost specialists in free speech. Brazil has criminalized racist expression since the 1980s. This was the very sensitive point of my, and I could be pragmatic about it. It's not the time to talk about it. It's hard to get to that point where we would strike that down. Maybe we will never will actually, but make the case, please, for Brazilians. Why should we allow racists to express their racism?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not intimately familiar with Brazilian history. So let me use the United States as an example, and maybe also some other countries, and then I can also get into some empirical data and so on. So we've already seen that the First Amendment was not always very speech protective, right? It's actually a relatively recent phenomenon. There was a time where you could go to prison for a very long time if you were critical of the government. There was also a time where if you were in Tennessee, the state that I live in the 1830s, you would go to prison if you argued against slavery. So this was banned in a number of states. There were states like Louisiana where if you argued for interracial marriages, you would go to prison. And of course, all of these states had all kinds of other tactics to punish the civil rights movement and advocates for racial equality. And so this made the civil rights movement realize that actually free speech was their most important weapon. If you're a minority, a persecuted minority, speech is your most important tool in shining a light on injustice, on being able to speak truth to power, to use a cliche, but one which is very apt in this moment. And free speech restrictions become lethally dangerous to you because if you don't have very principled, consistent approach to free speech, majorities get to define and enforce those restrictions. So laws against hate speech will protect groups that are favored by the majority, those who are in power. They will not protect vulnerable minorities. And so this is why um, everyone from Frederick Douglass to later civil rights groups were very clear about the importance of protecting free speech. It's why Jews in America were at the forefront of protecting the rights of Nazis to march through a neighborhood in Illinois that was inhabited by Holocaust survivors. This did not make the ACLU members very popular, but but I think go back and read the book "Defending My Enemy" by Ari Nair. It's a very eloquent case that makes that shows why it's so crucial to be principled and why it is an advantage for minorities to do so. And Ari Nair, by the way, fled. He was born in Nazi Germany, fled with his family in 1939. So literally, like just before he's and much of his other family was annihilated in the Holocaust. So he's not, he had skin in the game. He was not someone making a purely abstract argument. There's a very, you can also demonstrate with two concrete cases. So in 1949, there was a case called Termin Yellow versus Chicago. And this case is about a former Catholic priest who was very anti-Semitic, very racist. He gave this very controversial speech, and counter-protesters broke into the building, created chaos and violence. And then the city he was speaking in fined the racist priest because they said, well, this is on you because you used language to incite a mob, provoke a mob, you breached the peace. The case went before the Supreme Court, and the majority of the Supreme Court said, no, you can't punish someone for making controversial speech. Those who commit, who disturb the peace, who use violence, are the ones who should be punished. But there was one Supreme Court judge called Robert H. Jackson, who was a very interesting figure because he had been the chief prosecutor for the US in the Nuremberg trial. So he had prosecuted Nazis. And he said, well, you need to have a balance between order and free speech. And he said these famous words that are often used to argue for restrictions of free speech. He said, if you don't temper free speech, the Bill of Rights, free speech will, become a suicide pact. So he thought the Supreme Court went too far. But then in 1963, 187 Black students in South Carolina were protesting against racial segregation in front of the Capitol. The police in South Carolina said, well, if you protest, white citizens in South Carolina who are in favor of racial segregation are going to be so upset that they might attack you. There will be a breach of the peace. So you have to disperse your demonstration. They refused and they were all arrested. The case goes before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, as we showed in this case with a racist priest, the principle of free speech defends even unpopular speech. And so it was used to defend the rights of a persecuted minority. So instead of being a suicide pact, free speech came to serve as empowering a persecuted minority. And this is something that has happened again and again throughout history. So John Lewis, who was a famous civil rights advocate who was arrested on numerous times, said that without free speech, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings. And I've already, talked about Mandela and Gandhi, and the way that they saw free speech as absolutely essential to their struggle. In fact, if you go to apartheid South Africa, hate speech laws were being used to protect the white the whites against attacks, and of course done in a way, interpreted in a way so as to say that anti-apartheid speech was hate speech against the whites. You see it today in Venezuela. Venezuela adopted a comprehensive anti-hate speech law in 2017 that is being used against dissidents and journalists. And they reference hate speech laws in Germany and Europe to justify it. You see it in Russia, where there was a stand-up comedian there, an Azerbaijani citizen. He was only sentenced to 1 year in prison and then being expelled, whereas in Brazil you apparently risk 8 years of prison if you do hate stand-up that is deemed racist. So all of this to say that that hate speech laws are very unreliable method for advancing racial equality, for supporting minorities. Minorities need free speech even more than majorities, because majorities can typically rely on the political power that represent them, whereas minorities cannot. Now, this does not mean that we should disregard the psychological hurt that you as a persecuted or traditionally discriminated against minority can suffer from racist speech. I imagine that being Black in Brazil, that you can be confronted with systemic racism that is still in place. We should not ignore that. But first of all, is it going to be eliminated through sending a stand-up comedian in prison for 8 years? And I saw a case. I think they were acquitted, but there were two black comedians in Brazil who
Yeah,
were also prosecuted for hate speech. And this is a very common example of how these laws, because they're inherently subjective, will very often be used against the very minorities they were supposed to protect. We see this in Germany, we see it in the UK. Um, and also, you get into some tricky questions, right? Who are the protected groups? Who should be protected? Like, if you have a conflict between religious conservatives and LGBT activists, each of them using harsh language against the other, you're essentially saying to the state, who are the ones who should be protected here? So it has to choose sides, or it can decide that every single group based on identity should have their specific taboos protected. But then the consequences for free speech become very, very prejudicial indeed, right? And then also Brazil is a country with a lot of mixed ethnicities, right?
yeah,
So if I was a Brazilian, my mother is white, my father is black. So I don't know if I would be considered black in Brazil, but I don't personally, I don't perceive myself as belonging to one specific group. I think the color of your skin is hopefully the least interesting thing about
yeah,
your person. But should I then be able to claim a specific protection? Um,
yeah.
that
So you
it gets
mentioned
really thorny.
exactly. So coming back to Moraes a bit, he uses that language. So when Glenn Greenwald published in our largest newspaper, Folha de São Paulo, that he was doing fishing expeditions, he was ordering, targeting people for that, and he claimed in response to Glenn's stories that all he was doing was to fight electoral hate speech. Okay, so that term
Yeah.
doesn't exist in any of our laws. Hate speech
No.
doesn't either. So it's actually injuria racial, and that's the racist words criminalization, and it's being expanded by judicial activism. But anyway, um, what, I have two last questions for you. First of all, thank you for being here with me, and you've already started answering actually. So you've been here for a few days now. You've seen Brazilians in the flesh. So,
Yeah.
what are the seeds in Brazilian culture? I know you're not an expert, but
Yeah.
have you seen any seeds we could use, we could nurture into a culture of free speech that definitely doesn't exist now? And if you were Brazilian and looking into what's happening, you mentioned Léo Lins twice, the comedian who was sentenced to prison. Would you leave for greener pastures, or would you stay and try?
Oh man, I mean, with all the other great things in Brazil, I would probably suffer even more authoritarianism just because I think you have in many. I mean, I know there are. I know that I um, am hanging out in places that with people who are a lot more privileged than the way too many Brazilians who live in poverty. But I still think you have a great country with a great culture. So I would probably suffer and stay behind. But yeah, so maybe this is just a theory. Maybe it works and maybe it doesn't. When I've talked to Brazilians, it seems like that there's maybe not enough focus on sort of trying to show how censorship was an integral part of the military dictatorship. So that's sort of saying, and this might be something that resonates with the part of the left who is hesitant about supporting free speech because they don't want to be seen as adjacent to the right and Bolsonaro, sort of saying, making that link between a very recent authoritarian past and the way that censorship was used to consolidate a military dictatorship, as censorship has been used to consolidate every dictatorship throughout history, whether it's on the right, on the left, whether it's secular or religious. That's just page 1 of the dictator's playbook, right? And maybe do more to also see, what were the reforms that were being made in order to strengthen free speech when democratic reforms were being instituted. Maybe that's one way of really showing the importance of free speech to the DNA of Brazilian democracy, and that it transcends political differences and unites everyone who agrees that there should be a democracy, whether you're on the right or on the left. So that's one theory. I don't know if it would be successful or not, but as someone who has written a book on the history of free speech, I'm biased in that direction. Then I think I think it's crucial that's one of the reasons why I'm proud to work with Civis, is that Civis is an organization that is nonpartisan, that I think it seems to me succeeds in speaking to people both on the right and the left, that doesn't use free speech as a political prop for underlying ideological differences, and that just gives you more credibility. Maybe it doesn't give you as much reach as when you use it to appeal to people who are very online and very tribal. But I think it is the way to create long-term resilience for free speech. So maybe there are ways that more people in civil society can try and get people who have very different ideas together and sort of say, whatever our differences, whatever our different perspectives for the future of Brazil, we agree that democracy is the only viable way to govern this country. And for democracy to be successful, resilient, and future-proof, free speech must be the most important right, a meta right for all other rights, and really the bulwark of a future Brazilian democracy. Even if you don't get to like a First Amendment level of protection of speech, and you have a more pragmatic model. So those are like suggestions. I don't know if that's the way forward, but I mean, in many ways, I see Brazil as a bit of a swing state, right, for free speech and democracy. So I think Brazil has a huge impact on the global future, both on the regional but also on the global future of free speech and democracy. If Brazil continues to swing further in the direction of erosion of free speech, that sends a signal to the region, which already is experiencing a lot of issues, but it also sends a message globally that restricting free speech is a way to go, whereas Brazil can be a model, really a shining model. I mean, think of all the ways that Brazil is already admired globally, whether for its culture, its football, the image of Brazil, but if it also is able to be a model democracy, showing that free speech is not only sort of a Western concept, but you can actually create that in a diverse and very big, complex society as Brazil. That would be the gold standard. I mean, I would move here.
I hope it happens. Jacob Mchangama, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you'll come back soon.
Obrigado. Thank you.